Good morning and welcome to St. Peter the Apostle Anglican Church as we conclude the historical section of our discussion, what is Anglicanism? Anglicanism 101. We will essentially summarize what we have looked at for the past, and yes, I know this sounds freaky, the past 30 weeks. And today will be the last recorded video. Next week we're going to start on the Book of Common Prayer, and we would actually need to be here and go through the Book of Common Prayer. So this will be our swan song as far as the historical section. Now, if you can look at the whiteboard, you can see that what I've done is I have brought back the very second discussion that we had, and that was a response to Father Tarsitano's, what I called the Tarsitano Triangle. And what I did here was I basically fleshed out what he did, and instead of putting it in a linear fashion, which is the way I had it when we originally discussed it, I folded it on top of his triangle in order to give us a sense of the comparison between how he identified Anglicanism and how we have been looking at Anglicanism as we move forward. And as a brief review, I started with the broadest category, and that is Anglicanism currently. So Anglicanism currently, we see that we have, and I put in scare quotes, we have the Protestant Episcopal Church, or TEC, I don't even know what they're calling themselves today, apostates, that would be appropriate, but the Protestant Episcopal Church, or the Episcopal Church, and the C of E, the ACNA, which only some of them belong in under the title Anglican, the rest of them need to go someplace else. And then, of course, we have, in the center, we have the continuing Anglican movement. That's essentially where we are today as far as the general status. When we start to break down the specifics, there's Anglicanism historically, and we see that we began with the early church, and we moved from the early church through the Middle Ages to the 16th century. And then we see the second element, the 16th century and the 17th century, where much of what the contemporary, let me say broadly evangelical Anglicanisms identify as the core of what Anglicanism is. And then, of course, we have the 19th and 20th centuries, and I'm not even listing the 21st century, but the 19th and 20th centuries, where we have Anglo-Catholic and Anglo-Roman expressions of Anglicanism. And as we saw, Anglo-Catholic does not mean Anglo-Papism. We saw that when we looked at the Oxford movement, the Tractarian element, and then, of course, the Anglo-Catholic expression of borrowing some of the elements of both of those in their own definition. And then we had Anglicanism theologically, and these are the three ways: Anglicanism currently, Anglicanism in history, and Anglicanism theologically. These are the three ways that we need to incorporate in our understanding of how we're defining Anglicanism. Because at the point in which you take any one and eliminate the other two, you're going to create a distorted view of what Anglicanism is. And when we talk about Anglicanism theologically, we talk about Anglicanism from the Low Church or the Puritan/Presbyterian perspective. Each of these can, in and of themselves, be a representative theological position. And then we have the ACNA, which, as I said, it's a crapshoot as to whether or not they're going to be defined as Anglican or not. I mean, the Diocese of the Living Word, the Anglican Diocese of All Nations, those are staunchly and conservative Anglican jurisdictions within the ACNA. And then you've got other expressions which are barely Christian, no less Anglican. And then we have, again, the theological expression of either Anglo-Catholic or Anglo-Roman views of what Anglicanism is. So, all of this goes into the stew as we start to look at and attempt to define how we got to where we got to today. And we went through all of the historical information. We looked at the give and take. We looked at the to and fro. We looked at the tension between the various expressions of Anglicanism within the church. And when we distill it down to its most basic component, the question that really is being asked when we look at this question is the question, is Anglicanism Protestant or is it Roman? You can't say Catholic because Anglicanism is Catholic. It's just not. It's a different version of Catholic. Okay, we'll get to that in a minute. So when we start to talk about it, this is one of those areas where we find ourselves basically subjectively constricted by our choice of either of those definitions. So, first, if we say Anglicanism is Protestant, if by Protestant you mean opposing error with the intention of correcting it, then Protestant in that sense could certainly be understood as a Reformed or Protestant expression of Anglicanism, because it's more adjectival. If by Protestant one means a system of theology in opposition to Roman Catholic theology, then again, at least to some degree, Anglicans are Protestant. One clearly sees in the 39 Articles this type of pushback to various Roman Catholic positions. If by Protestant one means a distinct and separate theological system formulated in the 16th and 17th centuries exclusively, then no, Anglicanism is in no way Protestant. It is not constrained by two periods of history. And what you find is that people that adhere to that concept are historically ossified. They are frozen in time in those two periods. And I mentioned this at the very beginning. What you see is a constant refrain to those two periods when they reference anyone, and they only reference those two historical periods. You very rarely see an interaction with the early church. You very rarely see an interaction with the legitimate evangelical expressions during the Middle Ages, and they just pay lip service. And the argument always is, well, in this period of the 16th and 17th century, the Anglican divines went back to the early fathers and they brought the early fathers forward. No, they didn't. They cherry-picked. They picked and chose what there was no comprehensive interaction with the early church in the 16th and 17th century, because that wasn't the concern. The concern was Rome, and the concern were the Anabaptists. That was the concern. So this is where one's subjective presuppositions force a definition of what Anglicanism is. Because they identify with the 16th century, then that's what Anglicanism is. When in reality, it misses the whole historical point. Anglicanism during this time period, and Anglicanism in this time period was in reaction to two extremes. And this is why certain Anglo-Catholics, unfortunately, relativize the 39 Articles. And they say that the 39 Articles are historically constrained. In other words, the only reason that we have the 39 Articles in the Book of Common Prayer is because they're a part of the historical development of the Anglican Church. They're not really a binding confession. They are absolutely a binding confession. And the reason is this, and I asked a number of very let's just say prominent archbishops, I asked them this very question. And I said, because one of the responses I got was, well, you do realize there were originally 42 articles. And I said, with all due respect, I don't care whether there are 6 or 600 articles. If truth is transcendent, if it is not constricted by time, then every element of truth contained in the 39 articles is binding on us today. It is not relativized by history. You may not like it because it does not fit with your understanding of what Anglicanism is, but as my mom used to say, tough noogies. Because that's what Anglicanism, and Michelle's going to write that down. Because that's what the 39 articles did. They placed themselves right square in the middle of the argument between what is true and what isn't. All right? Now, continuing, if by Protestant one means a dedicated and specific emphasis upon a type of evangelical preaching of what one would call the gospel, whatever that is, to the virtual exclusion of all other elements of theology, liturgics being the essential difference, then Anglicanism is not Protestant, because it does not exclude those elements. What it winds up doing in certain cases is it tortuously redefines what those liturgical elements are, extracting it from any continuity with the church, and using the 16th and the 17th centuries as a cudgel to beat all of those other expressions out of the equation. Well, then there's the flip side. If by Anglicanism one means that that ecclesiastical expression that began with the English Reformation in the 16th century, then no. I contend that is not Anglicanism. And we've already seen that there are people that will say Anglicanism, the Church of England, began with Henry VIII. It did not begin with Henry VIII, and we demonstrated that. Secondly, if by Anglicanism one means an ecclesiastical expression that came, I just repeated myself, that came into existence with Henry's separation of the Church of England from the See of Rome, then also no, that is not Anglicanism. Now, I always get into trouble when I make this statement, but I'm going to make the statement anyway. Anglicanism, from my perspective, is neither Roman nor Protestant. It is both Catholic and Protestant. And there is a difference. The most important term to define is not Protestantism, because that would be a headache. To define Protestantism would be as difficult as it's been for the past 30 weeks to define Anglicanism. The most important term in that is Catholic, because this is the term that drives all of the evangelicals to distraction. This is where they freak out. Catholic, oh, the C word. It's like you're talking about cancer. Oh, the C word. Catholic, if we understand the meaning of the term, is a very biblical, it is a very historic understanding of the faith. And you can use any number of terms to define what Catholic means. The one that I like is whole, W-H-O-L-E. Universal is also used. Some people talk about complete, which would be a synonym for whole. But when we talk about Catholic, we're talking about the whole of the church. We're talking about the whole of the faith. Now, as Christians, we are going to disagree and we are going to have squabbles about the specifics. But the core of the faith transcends history. You start in the Old Testament. Another problem we have with the church today is we get too many people dismissing the Old Testament out of hand. But we start with the covenantal relationship in the Old Testament, and it goes all the way through to the New Testament to today. Because the concern for the church has always been the presentation, the accurate expression, a true understanding, and the preaching of the gospel. That's what we concentrate on when we talk about Catholic. We're talking about all of those elements of the theological understanding of the church that come to play, or come to bear, that are brought to bear when we want to discuss the power, the impact, and the necessity of preaching the gospel of Christ. The sacraments that we have, and I'll stick with the Dominical sacraments for now, baptism and the Eucharist, are the visible, they are the visible expressions. They are the visible preaching, if you will, of Christ's gospel. And this is why I used to tell my friends in the evangelical community, you ever been to a service where you've got a guy that preached a bad sermon? And you'll get the occasional, yeah, we got a real clunker last time, right? So you basically wasted 90 minutes, right? You just sat there and, yeah, exactly. So you come to an Anglican service, and you will always get the gospel. No matter how bad my sermon is, no matter how terribly I tank, I know that in about 8 minutes, you're going to hear the gospel preached in the consecration, in the words of consecration. And you, as a congregation, and anyone that attends an Anglican service is always protected from a stinker that I might present. Always. That, for me, was the genius of Cranmer and the Divines. The Book of Common Prayer stands on its own. It is an historically monumental work. I remember, I don't know if they still do it. I don't know if they teach anything in college now. But I remember when I took English literature, if you take European literature, guess what is taught? Well, was taught in European literature. The Book of Common Prayer as a product of English thought in literature, and the prose and the structure and the poetry is presented. So what Cranmer did in and of itself was phenomenal, and I'm going to stop because we'll be talking about the prayer book in the time to come. But the fact that he understood how important it was to make sure that bad preaching, which there was a lot of, just ask Tetzel if you see him, bad preaching was to be mitigated. It was to be offset by what the prayer book presents. And that is the gospel of Christ in unadorned, its purest form. So, what is Anglicanism? If by Anglicanism one means an ecclesiastical expression founded in the middle to late 1st century with the incursion of Claudius to Britannia, the establishment of an official Christian church over the course of the next century, the existence of this church evidenced by their bishops participating in various early church councils, the Council of Arles in 312, Nicaea in 325, just to name two, being the most well-known, that this church, being a part of the one unified, holy, Catholic Church, at least prior to the Great Schism in 1054, existing throughout church history from then until today, then I would contend that is Anglicanism. Fully acknowledging the challenges and the battles with the attempted Roman supremacy over the years, the ebbing into the Middle Ages requiring doctrinal clarification, improvement, rejection, and reformation, which we saw on numerous occasions. How many times did we encounter the phrase clergy abuse in the time that we've gone through this? To reform the clericals. So we recognize that this took place. But this led to a fuller, reformed expression and understanding of Anglicanism in the 16th and 17th centuries, from which we move and develop, because there were even problems with this. We didn't get a chance to spend a lot of time talking about it, but between the 17th and the 18th century, I think I mentioned it briefly, but between the 17th and the 18th century, Anglicanism had devolved to the point where if you were to simply change the clothing of the congregation, it would look like any evangelical church today. Minimal investments, and I mean bare minimum. Virtually nothing else taking place within the service. You might see a candle, maybe see a candle lit, maybe not. No altar. It would be very lax, no music. And then you have the Oxford movement coming in the 1800s and the 19th century, trying desperately to bring a sense of dignity, awe, reverence back into Anglicanism. And this is what created the tension at that time. So you see, even when we talk about the 16th and 17th century, there still were negatives. There still were drawbacks by what they did at that time period. It wasn't this monolithic age of gold within Anglicanism. It's like anything else. And I'll use an illustration that I had when I was taking Greek. My professor said, you're going to be, in my first year Greek class, my professor said to me, you're going to be studying Greek and it is going to solve 50% of all of the problems you have with the New Testament. And we all went, yay! And he said, it's going to create 100% more. And that's exactly what the 16th century did. It solved 50% of the problems. It went after the bad guys. And it went after them very well. But then it created all of this other mess to follow. So, I can go on and beat this a bit more, but as as we transition into the questions, I'll start with this. Does that help in understanding the full, comprehensive nature of Anglicanism? Does that give you a place from which to start when you are trying to understand Anglicanism?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So now, since I'm leading morning prayer this morning, we're going to. I'm going to open it up for questions, but I'm going to pay attention to the clock for the first time. Any questions?
Who taught you Greek? Where was your Greek?
D. Brent Sandy, who was one of the leading paprologists in the country, in the world at the time. He was the one that taught us Greek. And when I left Grace to go to Houghton to study Greek at Houghton, the 1 year that I took in Greek, this is how good Brent was. The 1 year that I took in Greek had me halfway through Greek 2 at Houghton. Wow. He was that good. I at one point, can't do it now, don't ask me to do it now, but I at one point could have read the Gospel of John in Greek. Now all I can do is quote 1 John in Greek. And arche hanalogos, hyologos, king, pros ton theon, katheos, hanalogos. So, 35 years of studying Greek, and that's what I get. So, and that's all on me. I mean, I'm still familiar. I'm exaggerating. But he was brilliant. He was brilliant. I loved him to death. He was a great professor. Anything else about it? This is your time. We've got 15 solid minutes this time.
I do want to just say thank you, because I walked into this class not knowing a single thing about Anglicanism.
And now you know less.
Yeah, no, I'm 100% confused. No, I'm not. I do think that you did a very good job.
Well, thank you. I wish I had more time. There's so much that we had to skip, so much.
Yeah, fabulous. See if I have it.
So when's your book coming out?
The book that helped me was Tarsitano, his on what is Anglicanism.
Mm-hmm.
He was.
Well, Lou wrote that. Lou wrote that for. Well, first of all, that was his doctoral. He was D-Min. That was his Doctor of Ministry thesis, and the intention for which he wrote that was to create a confirmation class for people coming out of non-Anglican or non-liturgical environments into a liturgical environment. Now, I love Lou, and Lou and I were friends, and we corresponded and spoke. I part issues with him. I part company with him at certain places, but nothing major. And that's why I continually recommend that book. That is probably the one Anglican book that I will always and continually recommend for those new to Anglicanism, coming out of any background.
And it's called What is Anglicanism?
An Outline of Anglican Life. An Outline of Anglican Life. That is the name of the book. And if you're looking for Lou presents it from the broad. He presents Anglicanism from the broad panoramic position. So he gives you that honeycomb that has all the little notches, and my book fills in the spaces that he left open.
Fills in the notches.
It fills in the notches, yeah. So that's why I usually recommend both books, but I will recommend Lou's book first. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and maybe we're getting to this as we go forward, but I didn't really know what this meant, and I didn't want to just think I put my own perspective on it. You said the gospel is preached in words of consecration. I don't know what words of consecration.
Who has a prayer book with them?
Page 80.
Well, that's where I was going. But yeah, page 8.
Friend night in which he was betrayed. He took bread.
Almighty Lord and everlasting God,
Safe.
God safe we beseech thee to direct. No, that's the wrong place.
All glory be to
To
thee,
thee, O
O
Lord,
Lord God, our
our
heavenly
Heavenly
Father,
Father,
for that thou, of thy tender mercy, didst give thine only Son, Jesus Christ, to suffer death upon the cross for our redemption.
There it is.
Okay. So,
And then when you complete it, then you're going to get the full gospel.
okay.
Okay?
So you're saying no matter how the sermon was, the gospel was always preached, but what do you, I still don't know what words of consecration means. That's.
Oh, that's the words of consecration simply mean, to consecrate means to set aside. So what we are doing is, we're doing a couple of things. Number one, we are consecrating the elements, so we are setting aside the elements. We are consecrating ourselves. That comes in with the, let's see, it's the
Souls and
oblation, epiclesis, invocation on page 81, where our bounden duty in service, we present our sacrifice of praise and thanksgiving. All of that is that we are consecrating ourselves. Because we are consecrating ourselves, well, I mean, by consecrating ourselves, we are consecrating ourselves to Christ. Because at the Eucharist, our union with Christ is confirmed. This is why it is so important that people take the Eucharist knowledgeably. They examine themselves, as the words of exhortation indicate. Because those that take, and we will get to it at some point if I'm still your priest. We will get to the 1 Corinthians passage that talks about people taking the Eucharist unworthily and dying. So this is why you will hear me speak about how significant it is to make sure you do truly and earnestly repent you of your sins. Don't play word games with God, because God don't play. Reminds me of In Living Color. Homie, don't play that.
We don't say that.
Homie, don't play that. You take the sacraments unworthily, and you put your life at risk. You do. Now, I'm not trying to scare anybody. That's why we have the call to repentance. That's why we have the general confession. It's that big cupcake right after the
Pour some sugar on me.
Def Leppard now becomes
Please
Anglican.
don't say.
That's why we have the general confession, and that's why we have absolution, to put your heart at ease, because at that point, we are placing it upon you to ensure that you are examining yourselves and you intend to lead a new life, following the commandments of God and walking from henceforth in His holy ways. Then you draw near, and you take that comfort, you take that sacrament, holy sacrament, to your comfort, devoutly kneeling. It is to be a comfort. Why is it to be a comfort? Because it is what Christ did in your place. He was the one that mounted that cross for you. So it should be a comfort to you, provided you follow His words by examining yourself. But when we talk about consecration, all of that gets baked into what we are doing between pages 80 and 83. All of that is the full orbed consecration. And that's another element that differs from what took place in the 16th and 17th century. Because if you look at the consecration of the 16th and 17th century, I don't have my prayer book with me, otherwise I'd show you. The consecration in the 1662 is about 1/4 of what we do. It is that abbreviated. So you don't get the oblation, you don't get the epiclesis, you don't get the invocation, you don't get any of that. We can have theological debates about that all you want. I prefer the 1928. I like the 1662. I think it has some very good things. I think it has some challenges. But the point that Cranmer had, I'm getting into the prayer book. I need to stop talking about the prayer book. We'll talk about this as we move into the prayer book. But that's what we're talking about when we're talking about consecration. That consecration is the union, is the confirming element, if you will, not only of setting aside elements to be used for a holy purpose, but it's setting aside us to be used for a holy purpose, because we are being set aside in our union with Christ, just as the bread and the wine become the means through which Christ is brought to us.
That's beautiful.
I didn't write it, Cranmer did.
I just meant the whole thing, not
Sorry, that's the
words.
church phone. So, Miss Hoff, you're gonna... Hoff? Didn't she sing for the Bangles?
Yeah. Yeah.
I'll have to check that out one more time.
Brief question about the board. Bottom right, where it says Anglicanism theologically
Yeah.
and not theology. It's Anglicanism theologically.
Yeah, these groups define Anglicanism based on their theology.
Okay.
So, I'll give you an example. This is an extreme example, and I'm going to distort this a little bit just so that it's clear in your mind. This is not a 100% accurate presentation, but it'll paint the picture for you. Within the Church of England, we had numerous debates and discussions and dissensions during this time period, the 16th, 17th century. We had non-jurors, we had those that would not conform to the crown, etc. All right? So, what winds up happening is we have this build-up of what at that time was called evangelical influence. All right? Martin Bucer comes over from France. Was he in Strasbourg at this time, or what? Let's just say he comes over from the continent. He was like horse manure, Bucer. He was all over the trail. So it's kind of hard to place him down. But he came over in 1549. He came over to. You'll never forget that now. It's that visual image is in your mind. You'll never forget that. Bucer came over. Peter Martyr from Italy came over, and they brought with them the Reformed teaching from the continent. Okay? What winds up happening is it starts to spread within the Church of England, not in a bad way, it just starts to take seat in the Church of England. I don't think it was in a bad way. And certain people now glom onto this, and they start to push, and they start to push, and they start to push. And their attempt is to purify the church. So what they're doing is they're not taking the historical church as it is and correcting minor things that may be problematic, but leaving the structure intact. The blueprint, the pattern that was revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai. What they did was they wanted to raise the entire R-A-Z. They wanted to raise the entire edifice. They wanted to bring it down and start something completely new. Okay, so they theologically were defining Anglicanism, and the Presbyterians were kind of a halfway. In many ways, they were a halfway point between the classical expression of Anglicanism with bishops, priests, deacons, and the Puritans, which is the far. Just in case you're wondering, it doesn't really matter, but as an historical note, the more you, the closer you stayed to the Church of England post-Henry in the time period, the closer you stayed to that, you would be identified as a conservative. So all of what we look at in the changes within the church, the Reformation is considered left because it broke from Rome, the conservative. And then we have even a more radical Reformation when we talk about the Anabaptists. So the idea of how one understands Anglicanism has to be understood in terms of all three. You can't just take one. The Presbyterians tried to keep some structure of government, and they modified that to turn into teaching elder, ruling elder, and minister. And I'm still trying to figure out where they got that, but I've asked a half a dozen of my Presbyterian friends that read my book, and it's where do you guys get teaching elder and ruling elder? And after they stumble over their tongue a couple of times, they point out a couple of passages in Timothy, and I go, that has nothing to do with creating an office, because that's what it is. It is an ordained office. Rather than having bishop, priest, and deacon, they have minister, teaching, and ruling elders. So, but anyway, but as you can see, they kept that tripartite structure. They tried to keep that tripartite structure. They just did it within a Presbyterian form of government. We would have had the House of Bishops. They would have had a session or general council, something along those lines.
So how did Scotland drift or turn or whatever into Presbyterianism so low when the ruling class in Scotland was Roman Catholic?
John Knox. That's how. Knox left England. He went to Geneva, spent a lot of time with Calvin, and there's a lot of argument about this, but I'll just throw it out for you. There is a contention that Presbyterianism was actually developed by John Knox, not John Calvin. And that's what he brought back to Scotland. And that's what he levied on the whore that was sitting on the throne, Mary. That was his words, not mine. And
Just a man or two. I mean, what is it among friends?
I can't remember the name of the book, but it just is the name of the piece that he wrote. But it is so typical of Knox. It was. This is not an exact quote, but this is kind of what he was saying. The monstrous rule of the whorish women in England. It was just he was vicious. He was vicious. But to answer your question, that's what winds up happening. So what happens? Knox comes back to Scotland. This again it's a very broad overview. But Knox comes back to Scotland. He tries to implement this form of government in Scotland. It takes root in some areas, and in other areas it does not. And then there's pushback from England. Laud comes in and introduces the prayer book, which creates a massive fight in Scotland. And when the dust settles, the Scottish Episcopal Church winds up being formed. There's still a strong representation of Presbyterianism within Scotland, but if you look at the 1789 Book of Common Prayer, the 1928 essentially takes the consecration service from the 1789 Book of Common Prayer.
Thank goodness for the Scottish Episcopal Church.
There
We
you go.
both had bishops here.
That is very true, and there's a lot of contention over that. So, Samuel Seabury, yeah, that was quite an issue, and it still is amongst some. Okay, one quick question. Anybody? One final question before we head up to morning prayer? I gotta clean all this stuff up before I get up there.
I was going to ask about the affirmation of St. Louis.
Oh,
That-
good heavens.
No, no.
We'll have to wait.
We'll have to wait.
That'll
Another
wait.
whole day.
Yeah, that in and of itself is also a challenge on some issues. Okay? All right.
Cool.